Empower the use of open source with software composition analysis from Revenera.
Hello, I'm Kendra Morton, Product Marketing Manager at Revenera. You're listening to a software composition analysis podcast where we discuss the importance of open source use in modern software development and how organizations are managing associated compliance and security risk. We once again welcome to our discussion Martin Callinan, Director at Source Code Control. Martin, it's great to have you once again.
Thanks for welcoming me back.
Absolutely. In a recent podcast, you and I talked about the fallout of the Log4Shell vulnerability, since it seems as if the dust is settling a bit. However, we reached the conclusion that it's really not just about, or should I say, you reached the conclusion that it's really not just about Log4j in reality. You compared that security threat to Heartbleed. They almost read identically in terms of managing and remediating issues. The takeaway is that we're really not that much further along than 2014. However, we do have more guidance and tools today to help us move forward. So, today's discussion, we're going to focus on, again, key learnings from Log4Shell vulnerability. Say that 3 times fast. And talk about software bill of materials initiatives, ongoing diligence, and the importance of being proactive versus reactive in controlling and understanding what's in your code. That's what we're going to cover today. So, first question to you. When you look back on Log4Shell and vulnerabilities like Heartbleed, what should organizations be doing to minimize the fallout?
Well, I think the real fallout related to any situation like this is if you are the developer of software, how can you build trust to your customers in the software that you're producing? So how can you demonstrate, to a prospect, a partner, existing customer, that if a similar situation comes up in the future, you've got a strategy for managing that to minimize the risk to the customer. And likewise for the acquirer of software solutions, how can you trust your software suppliers that they'll manage that situation for you? So it's not just a case of, oh, there's a vulnerability, let's find it. If we've got it in our code, let's fix it, and we just move forward. That's not a strategy for managing that. And there's been a lot of press about we can't trust open source software. It's not even about open source software, it's about software in general. You've got to accept all software comes with flaws. The flaws are fixed, but how do you get that fix out to customers? And how do you, like I said, how do you demonstrate if you're the software producer, how can you demonstrate to customers that you can manage that situation for them?
Yeah, it's really there's a lot more benefit to open source use and the advantages
Yeah,
of open source,
yeah,
right? And you just have to couple that with a pretty robust strategy for managing it,
yeah.
and so that organizations and development teams can use it to their best advantages.
Yeah, I mean, like 4J or Heartbleed or any vulnerability, and the fallout as we started this conversation, you know, that is a symptom. It's not the root cause of the problem. The root cause of the problem is, sadly, a lot of software companies are so pressured to deliver code, are not investing both in resources of people and tools to track and manage the use of open source. Um, I've seen articles saying, we can't trust open source, but it's not about trusting open source. There's good open source and there's bad open source. There's good proprietary software, there's bad proprietary software. Um, you've got to be able to differentiate between the good software and the bad software. And that goes right back to, I refer to it as secure by design. If you've got technical challenges and you find some code which is open source, which addresses that technical challenge, it may address the technical challenge, but it may be bad code. What I mean by that is it could be badly supported. It could be very out of date code. So if there's an issue going forward, it's probably not going to get resolved, which causes, in the future a potential problem, which could be expensive to fix.
Mhm.
So you got to look at the root cause, and not just the symptom.
We talked a little bit about it in our last podcast,
Mm.
but you kind of hinted at it moments ago too. But in some organizations, not that it's a strategy, but almost an idea because of, they're doing, their day-to-day business
Yeah,
of fix it and forget it and move on,
yeah.
right? But Heartbleed is
Mm.
a good example of why that's not a good strategy or
Yeah,
outlook.
yeah. Well, also since Heartbleed, which we did touch on previously as well, there's far more guidance and industry initiatives to help both acquirers of software and producers of software to build trust in that kind of software supply chain, as it's referred to. So an example I would give you would be the Open Chain project, which was hosted by the Linux Foundation. A lot of big software companies and small software companies are involved in that. We're involved with it as a service provider. But the goal of Open Chain is how can you build that trust in the software supply chain, and it's really about the process. So can you identify all the third-party code in your code? Can you build a software bill of materials which is accurate? When you ship your software, you're not shipping a risk onto customers. And the idea is it's now an ISO standard, ISO 5230. The idea is that a software company can implement the processes defined by OpenChain, which is tracking all that open source in your code, and you can get a badge, an ISO standard, which you can share with prospects and customers. Say, this is our process for managing the software supply chain. Therefore, there is a level of trust that we do have a process for tracking and remediation of open source in our code. So then, if you're an acquirer of a software solution and you're asking questions of your suppliers, how do you manage this problem? And you see one of the suppliers is conformant with ISO 5230, then you can have confidence in that supplier. If the other supplier can't give you that confidence, it helps you in your decision-making process. So that's just one example. There's quite a few industry initiatives. The other one is around software transparency. So a project started by NTIA in the US that all software should come with a software bill of materials, which is basically an inventory of all the third-party code that makes up the particular software solution. You can think of it like the ingredients on food packaging. So if you had a nut allergy, you'd check the food packaging to see if there's anything to do with nuts in the ingredients, and you can avoid that particular food. Likewise, you can check the software bill of materials for what components they're using, version numbers, and if there was a Log4j situation, you could check the bill of materials of the latest release of the software and say, well, actually, I know it's in my code. So either I go back to my supplier to try and fix it, or I fix it myself, potentially.
Yeah. That's a good segue because you talk about software build
Mm-hmm.
materials having an inventory of what's in
Mm.
code and what's in application. So, do you think is having a software bill of materials, if you will, is it really a panacea to a mature open source management strategy?
I don't think it's a panacea. And the reason why I say that is, first of all, are all software bill of materials going to be consistent, in formats and the day-to-day supply? There are organisations like the NTIA are trying to define what should be in a software bill of materials. The tools that are used to create software bill of materials could vary. So how accurate is the software bill of materials? You could fall into a false sense of security, pardon the pun, because you've got a software bill of materials which is inaccurate and the vulnerability is announced. You check the software bill of materials, you can't see it in the SBOM. Does that mean it's not there? It could still be there. It's just not been reported in the software bill of materials. also, I think there's a risk of, if you think of modern software, how many releases you get. You think of apps on your phone daily updated. The customer is going to end up with multiple, maybe hundreds of SBOMs that you'd have to plow through to try and find if there's a situation. So I still think there's a lot of work to do about the implementation of SBOMs. There's talk about should they be publicly available. If they're publicly available, doesn't that give information about an application of how you might exploit it, knowing what's in the makeup of the code? So I still think it's just the start of the journey as regards SBOMs. I mean, it's a great initiative. I do think customers or companies developing software definitely should be looking at providing some sort of transparency to their customers for sure. So yeah, it's a good thing, but it's not a panacea.
Right.
Yeah.
It sounds like then it's a part of a larger whole. And it
Yeah.
also sounds like too that there needs to be, from an industry perspective, perhaps a clear and more agreed upon and definition
Mm.
of what an SBOM is and what's in an SBOM and what's really required. And you mentioned several like NTIA and
Yeah.
Open Chain, but there's a lot. We're seeing a lot more regulations and governance coming into play,
Yeah.
like those that you mentioned.
Yeah. And it's not actually that new. Like, this regulation has been coming for some time. In fact, the vulnerability related to Equifax a few years ago was
Hmm.
was that the press around that was this was a game changer for security, but we're still here.
Yeah.
But really, that did start lots of the discussions around how do we address this supply chain problem. And what people listening to this podcast could be doing is you could actually get involved. So the NTIA project, Open Chain, the community projects, anybody can contribute. Obviously, the more people contribute, the more discussion there is, the longer it takes to make decisions. There is a lot of opinions about what is the minimum viable software building materials. At the end of the day, it will be how accurate are those SBOMs. And if you get situations where SBOMs are inaccurate and don't solve a problem, people lose confidence in them,
Hmm.
and they'll be supplied, and people won't ever use them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
What will it take, do you think, to get organizations, again, SBOMs are a part of a larger whole of
Mm.
what needs
Yeah.
to be implemented, I think, to have a robust open source management strategy and program within organizations. But what do you think it will take for organizations to be more proactive rather than reactive, especially when it comes to, you touched on it at the beginning of our conversation, it's that software supply chain
Hmm.
and the importance of knowing, where code is coming from and what's in your code, because today, right, with partners and vendors and all contribute and others contributing, that software supply chain becomes a lot more complex.
I think it's already started, but it's when it impacts money. It's always money that talks. Right? So if it impacts, if you're a software company and the inability to prove you can manage this problem, or inability to provide an SBOM affects your revenues, that drives change. And of course, regulation. So what I mean by affecting revenue, if you are selling a software solution to companies and they say, we can't buy your solution unless you do these things, then you will adopt those things. And obviously with regulation, we are moving into a world of we should do this into we have to do this. The executive order that's talked a lot about, this requirement about SBOMs, that wasn't the first piece of regulation or guidance. The European Union have got this for cloud solutions, got it for IoT. There's other industries like the payment card industry. They've got a secure software development framework for companies developing software related to taking payment card transactions. The common theme across all those guidelines and frameworks is either an inventory of open source components, which is basically what an SBOM is, or an SBOM. So this has been in play for some time. I think now we're at a point where things like Log4j help because it raises the profile of the risk and raises the profile of the potential solutions, one of them being an SBOM. So that drives consumers' behaviors to ask the questions back in their supply chain. You supply software to me. How do you deal with this? Can you give me an SBOM? And we are seeing that around the world, regardless of it's White House executive order which has raised the profile, but we're seeing procurement departments taking that up as well and saying we want a software bill of materials. And I think that's what drives behaviour.
Yeah.
Also,
So
you also sorry, Kendra, you also
no,
get
that's okay.
peer pressure. So if you get enough momentum, if go back to OpenChain, the goal of OpenChain now they've got an ISO standard is to get people to adopt it. So increasingly, if you're competing and everyone's competing for business, and you're losing business because your competitors can provide a software bill of materials, you will definitely drive your business to produce a software bill of materials. So I think you can get that peer pressure. There'll be a tipping point where so many companies are doing it, you have to do it. There's always leaders and followers, early adopters and so on and so on. So I think we're at the early adopter stage where companies are leading the way with doing this, and companies will follow in their wake. I think it's inevitable.
Yeah, that idea maybe of kind of like you said, those leaders and followers, kind of that competitive pressure
Yeah.
of implementing processes, tools, people within an organization that kind of create a best practice around open source management and having secure control over your applications or over applications that are produced and shipped to customers. I think you're right, and there's much more awareness about it today than there has been. And like you said, that's been growing. We've been seeing that increase year over year.
I think part of the problem is that there's a lack of understanding about how software development works. So, it's procurements, that buy software solutions, not necessarily the customer understands software development. There's other aspects of business like ISO 9001 or ISO 27001 for information security. Sometimes you cannot do business with a large company unless you've got those standards, and it's quite well understood, and you invest in doing those. Software development seems to be different, and I think it's because people don't understand how software development works. It's complicated. Leave it to the developers. But I think that's changing. So more and more companies will say you need that standard, or you need to provide an SBOM or whatever it might be. The more that happens, it's inevitable. Let's invest in it. Let's get it done.
Yeah, let's get it done for sure. Well, Martin, thank you. I appreciate this discussion. Thank you once again for joining me today.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye, everybody.
All right, thanks. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us, and we hope to see you again or talk to you again soon on another software composition analysis podcast from Revenera. Have a great day.
Empower the use of open source with software composition analysis from Revenera.